In the previous video discussions about the Western way of awakening, we discussed the greater nature of which we are a part of, and that nature existed prior to our birth, from which we came into this existence, into this three-dimensional reality, and then will be subsequent to our death, that nature will continue even into these other realities. We can get somewhat of a feeling for our growth and understanding of how nature would work from a more Western point of view, since really we can consider that we exist in a four-dimensional nature, because space-time, since Einstein's theory of relativity came into being, space-time is now accepted as a dimensional aspect of our reality. As of now, it's pretty standard fare among the physicists and generally any layperson that comes across that concept. It's pretty well established and pretty well accepted. In the beginning, of course, it was critiqued, and maybe there was elements of doubt in it, but from that Western sense, as we postulate the understanding, and then we investigate it, and we criticize it, and we critique it, and we tear it apart and put it back together, and eventually establish the veracity of it, then it comes to be accepted, just as this was accepted. So the point being is that where we once had a more limited consideration of our reality of being three and only three dimensions, now we consider that four dimensions, including space-time, is really the real model of our reality. Now, in quantum mechanics, they are still undergoing that scientific process, because in their models they come up with that there's like 12 dimensions of reality. Now, as these are proved correct or incorrect, our understandings will change, and we'll have even a greater understanding of the greater nature of our reality. And basically that's in a simplistic type of understanding, that is what was preceded our birth and is subsequent to our death, is a greater dimensions. Now, there is such a thing as flatlanders, which were two-dimensional beings. They couldn't conceive of three dimensions. They had no understanding of height and depth. They could only see in two dimensions, in length and width, so that for us, who are three-dimensional beings, that was just totally inconceivable to these fictitious flatlanders who only existed in two dimensions. Well, we are somewhat in that same similar position, being three-dimensional beings, four if you include space-time. We're in that same similar position that we can't ordinarily, without extreme effort or some unusual circumstance, conceive or perceive of more than three dimensions. That isn't to say that they don't exist, it's just that it's not in our realm of perception, in our realm of understanding. But the key to grasp on here is that nature is greater than just the three-dimensional nature of which we're so accustomed to, and nature precedes us and is also subsequent to our being. And in our last video discussion, we were beginning to talk about responsibilities. That is the first step in our reasonable and logical approach to finally coming to be aware of a Western way of awakening. And as such, then it becomes our responsibility to attempt to gain the awareness and the understanding of a greater nature. Or at least that's the responsibility for those that want to be more aware or more enlightened. We have to take up this mantle of responsibility because nobody in general is going to do it for us. We can get all sorts of books, we can get all sorts of gurus, we can get all sorts of spiritual leaders, and they can all give us information, and they can tell us about their experience, and they can give us anecdotal information. But truly, the only one that can grow our own personal awareness is us personally. So that has to be our first step, is taking that responsibility. So this is where we must constantly bear in mind the responsibility for which we've committed to this experience, as we've discussed in previous video discussions, and that our purpose, again, is totally to nurture and return a fruitful awareness from our experience. And that responsibility takes us into the mind itself. And this is the common theme and the common element of both Eastern and Western ways, is that you have to deal with the mind. And it's not really unusual that that the Eastern way or the Western way, when they deal with the mind in trying to gain a greater awareness and the greater awareness of a greater nature, that it eventually comes down to being part of your consciousness and a universal consciousness and a oneness of everything. It doesn't matter if it's Eastern understanding or Western understanding. It usually comes down to that. But from an Eastern understanding, that understanding tends to go into that realm and exist in that realm of the universal consciousness or total awareness, but it doesn't then come back and explain a more linear Western type of way of, well, where did we come from? Where did we go? Where are we going? Exactly. Why are we here? What purpose is all this? And of what purpose was our birth then coming out of from wherever we were and going in past the portal of death? Then what purpose is that? These types of awarenesses and understandings are not the objective of the Eastern types of understandings and awareness. And so that's why we're presenting it from a Western way of awakening. But both from an Eastern and a Western sacred findings and books and revelations, it is understood that it's the mind itself that must be quieted and let go in some fashion to become enlightened. But up to now, again, in the Eastern aspect, past the portal of death, that isn't the concern of that type of enlightenment. And in a Western way, since we're dealing with the mind and we're dealing with the ego, we're actually prohibited to some degree in under that understanding, because we're so the mind is so attached to the ego. And the ego, of course, does not pass the portal of death. That's something that is central to our existence in the three-dimensional realm. And because the ego, which is so central to us, doesn't go past the three dimensions, it cannot possibly connect all the dots. The best it can do is stand to one side and deny the existence of a greater nature or any of the information that would come from it. And it would, in the ego's estimation, just mark that kind of understanding beyond our understanding. Again, much like Flatlanders. But again, this greater awareness doesn't happen to occur in some mystical revelation or flash of understanding. It can occur in a quite methodical and Western and scientific method by degrees, by rigorous ordinary efforts over extended periods through both explicable and inexplicable circumstances. Awareness is increased, just as we were talking about the general population's increase in awareness of a fourth dimension being space-time. So, measure by measure, step by step, little by little, a heightened awareness will come through the results of the choices we make, of which we have the responsibility for. For instance, it may make sense that if you're going to gain a greater awareness than your mind, paradoxically, which again is associated to the brain and the brain to the body, then it would make sense that to be at your optimal mental state, you have to be in your optimal physical state. So a responsibility to maintain the health of the body is part of gaining a greater awareness. Now, it's a curious thing about the mind. As we said, the mind itself, both from an Eastern perspective and a Western perspective, it's understood that the mind, in some sense, has to be dropped to gain a greater consciousness, a oneness. And the curious thing about the mind is that in the same sense it must be dropped, paradoxically, you must employ it to its best use, because at the time of your birth, then the seed of awareness, of which you had no awareness prior to your birth of a three-dimensional reality, was planted within the mind, and that's the awareness that you're responsible for growing. Well, tethered to the mind is the will. There's often a discussion about free will. Do we have a free will or don't we have a free will? Well, we can say unequivocally that we do not have a free will. What we have is free choice, but the will that we have associated to our willpower, however you want to describe that, through determination or whatever, but we each have a will. Well, our will is actually tethered to a greater will from a greater reality, which is part of the greater nature of things. So anything that's tethered is actually not free completely. And our will is actually tethered to the greater will of a greater nature. And it's by that will, by our own will, that we have the opportunity and ability to understand and perceive the greater nature and learn to awaken then, or become enlightened to the greater reality of which we exist in. The reality as we commonly know it is just a part, it's a link in a greater chain of links of reality. And that's what we'll be going into in the next video discussion of the Western way of awakening.